Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing my February wrap-up, so I will be talking about the 10 books that I read this month. Sorry this video is coming out a little late. It is midterm time at school right now, so I have been super busy. If you're interested in my thoughts on everything I read, keep watching. The first book I read was The Tenet of Wildfell Hall by Bronte. I really liked this book. I read it for my Victorian era class, and I'm still warming up to Victorian literature for sure. It took me quite a bit to get into this book, but once I got into it, I actually really enjoyed it and what it had to say about gender roles in the Victorian era. It follows the story of Helen Graham, a mysterious woman that moves into Wildfell Hall. All the townspeople know about her is that she is a reclusive widow, and everyone's trying to find out more. Our main character, Gilbert Markham, falls in love with her, and as the story goes on, he starts to learn more and more of her secrets. It's told in an epistolary format, starting with Gilbert's point of view, and then as it continues, it goes on to Helen's. I found that part to be a lot more interesting. I really liked reading from her point of view. I'd never read a Bronte novel before, and I was really happy to start with one by Bronte, as it seems that she's usually the most overlooked sister. I actually wrote a paper about this book and how it illustrates gender norms in the Victorian era, and there's a lot to say here. It is a very early feminist book. A lot of the things that Helen does in here were completely against gender norms for that time. I wasn't expecting to like it much going in, but overall I did enjoy it quite a bit. I gave it 3.5 stars. Next up is Wilder Girls by Rory Power. I gave this book 3 stars. It has been so hyped up on BookTube, but it wasn't really for me. If you haven't heard of it, it is basically like Lord of the Flies, but with queer teenage girls at a boarding school. The island that their school is on has been locked down because of a disease that has been spreading throughout the students and teachers that causes them to genetically mutate, which I thought was a really interesting premise. There is a lot of really creepy body horror in this, so if you're into that kind of stuff, definitely check it out. I totally understand why people love this book, but I'm just kind of finding that I usually don't enjoy YA. It just feels a little too juvenile for me. I really liked the queer representation in this though, and I think I would have really loved this book if I had read it maybe 5 years ago. Next, I'm going to be talking about The Book of the Duchess and the House of Fame by Geoffrey Chaucer. I'm going to be talking about these two together because they're both from my Chaucer class. If you don't know who Chaucer is, he is one of the most famous Middle English writers, and I'm taking a class entirely on his works. These are both 2 long poems, and The House of Fame was definitely my favorite of the 2. The Book of the Duchess did not make much of an impression on me. I rated it 2 stars. The House of Fame, however, I really enjoyed. I rated it 4 stars. It had a lot of really fun imagery and some really insightful commentary on the nature of fame and how fleeting it is and how random it seems to be. Definitely isn't for everybody. It is published in the original Middle English, so it's a bit of a tough read, but if you've been wanting to check out Chaucer's work, I would recommend starting with The House of Fame. It just has a lot of interesting topics to explore and a lot of really fun moments. Next, I read We Set the Dark on Fire. This was recommended to me by one of my favorite booktubers, Sunny from A Sunny Book Nook. If you have not heard of them, you need to check them out. I love every video that they come out with. But anyways, they recommended this to me and I didn't think I would love it, but I really enjoyed it. I gave it 4 stars. It's kind of a dystopian book where women go to school to train to be the perfect wife. In this society, wealthy men have 2 wives, a primera and a segunda. Our main character, Dani, is a primera, and when she's married off to her husband, she finds out her segunda is her worst enemy at school, Carmen. From then, we get a really interesting political storyline as their husband is the president's son, and there's a lot of political unrest going on in their country that really mirrors some issues from today. The main part of the story for me, though, was the beautiful, forbidden, sapphic romance. It was really well written, it was really beautiful, it was definitely a slow burn, which isn't for me as much, but I really enjoyed it. It didn't get 5 stars for me just because it is a YA book and I just can't ever completely gel with them. I really would have loved to see more of the relationship between Dani and Carmen. I feel like it didn't get a ton of attention until the middle to end of the book. The exposition in this took a long time. It was a great read though, and I gave it 4 stars. I didn't expect to like this as much as I did, so if you're even a little bit interested, I would definitely recommend checking it out. Next, I read The Guest List by Lucy Foley. I honestly don't have too much to say about this book. At the time, I remember it being an exciting read, but I don't really remember much of it now. I'm sure you've heard of this book. It was one of the most popular thrillers of 2020. It's about a wedding party on an island and somebody dies and they're trying to figure out who did it. Since I've read so many thrillers in the past year, when I start one, I feel like I can see exactly where it's gonna go, and obviously that's not a very enjoyable reading experience, so I decided that I'm kind of gonna take a step back from traditional thrillers for a little bit. Another thing I really didn't like about this book was the self-harm scenes. It felt like they were added on just to make one of the characters feel more edgy, and I really didn't like that. Overall, I gave this book 2 stars. It was really forgettable for me. Next was My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix. This is the second book I have read by Grady Hendrix, and just like the first one, it is a 5-star read. If you love 80s horror like I do, you absolutely need to check this one out. It takes place in the 1980s, where we meet our 2 main characters, Abby and Gretchen. They become best friends in 5th grade, and we follow their friendship until high school, where Gretchen starts acting really weird. Abby can notice that something is up with her, and as things just get weirder and weirder and there's more strange occurrences, Abby decides that the only plausible explanation is that Gretchen is possessed. It's a super fun read that actually tackles a lot of really dark topics, which I think it did well. While I usually don't like a ton of pop culture references, this book didn't take itself seriously, so I felt like it was okay in this instance. All of the chapter titles are 80s songs that fit the vibe of the chapter, and I really loved that, especially because some of them were songs that I loved so much when I was younger. The end of this book really hit me, and it actually made me cry. I really loved the friendship in this book, and I kind of have a soft spot for books where evil is defeated by the power of friendship. It's just so wholesome, and it's so sweet. And I loved this book. If you are into retro horror at all, I would definitely recommend this book for you. After that, I read The Romance of a Shop by Amy Levy, which is another book that I read for my Victorian era class. I liked it. It was a pretty short story about 4 sisters who open up a photography studio to make ends meet after their father dies. It takes place in London in the late 1800s, so they obviously run into some prejudice based on them being women owning a business. It's a quaint story detailing the lives of these sisters, their loves, and how they make their way living in a sexist society. We also read some poems by Amy Levy in my class, and I think I enjoyed those more. She was a Jewish lesbian writer living in the Victorian era, so I felt like that was a really interesting identity to read from in that time period. I understand that it wouldn't have been very safe for her to do this, but I wish there was more sapphic content in her work. I would have loved to have seen that. Overall, The Romance of a Shop was a good example of a new woman novel, and I'm glad I read it. I gave it 3 stars. Next, I read Speak No Evil by Uzodinma Abuela. This book was heartbreaking, but it was a great read. I read it for my queer lit class. This book follows Niru. He is a high schooler that was born in Nigeria and is now living in Washington, D.C. with his family. He's just starting to figure out he's gay when his father also finds out by looking at his phone and seeing dating apps on it. His family reacts really badly, and the book kind of just goes from there. It's best to read this book without a lot of context, in my opinion, but keep in mind it does get hard and potentially triggering at some points. It was very well written with a really interesting stream of consciousness writing style. It handled the heavy topics in this really well. I gave it 4 stars. It wasn't a perfect read for me, but I'm really glad that I read it. I would really recommend this if you're looking for some good own voices, queer lit, from a very unique perspective. The last book I read in February was Kill Creek by Scott Thomas. I loved this book. It is definitely a new favorite for me. It's about 4 famous horror writers that get an invitation to spend Halloween night in a haunted house. As soon as I heard that premise, I knew I would love it. It reminded me a lot of It, with the house being its own entity that eventually draws the writers back to it. I've really been craving fun horror lately, and this gave me exactly what I wanted. I don't want to give too much of this away because I don't want to spoil anything, but if you really love haunted house stories, I would definitely recommend checking this one out. It was just such a fun read for me. I rated it 4.5 stars because it definitely wasn't perfect, but I just enjoyed it so much. And that's all for today. Those are the 10 books that I read in February. It was a pretty good reading month. I think there were a lot of 4 and 5 stars mixed in there. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give me a like. If you want to see more from me, subscribe. And if you've read any of these books, leave me a comment down below. I would love to talk about them with you. And thank you so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!